surviving until he found strange black eggs on his land. But when he saw what was inside, his life changed forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning light crept slowly across the cracked boards of the farmhouse, pale and thin like water seeping through broken stone. Malcolm King had been awake long before the sun. Sleep had become an unnecessary luxury, something for men who could still afford the peace of mind to close their eyes. He sat on the edge of his bed, the old springs beneath him groaning under his weight, and looked out through the street glass at what had once been his pride, a stretch of land that now looked more like a battlefield after defeat. The earth outside was gray-brown and lifeless, its surface split from drought and time. Once, corn had grown tall here, so tall that his boy used to run between the rows pretending they were city streets. Once, the cluck of hens had echoed from every side of the house, and the smell of feed and hay had meant work, purpose, a kind of rhythm to life. But those were memories, dry and far away like the soil that refused to yield anything but dust. Malcolm rose and stretched his back. The sound of his joints reminded him that he had been farming this land for 30 years. His father before him had done the same. The Kings had owned this patch of Alabama dirt since the end of the war, passed down like an inheritance of stubbornness. But legacy didn't pay the bank. His hands were still strong, the kind of strong that came from decades of shoveling, lifting, and mending. But the bills stacked on his kitchen table made those hands useless. The electricity had been cut off 2 weeks ago, and at night he relied on an old lantern that filled the rooms with yellow light and the faint smell of oil. He pushed open the back door and stepped outside into the heavy stillness. The air smelled faintly metallic after last night's storm, and the grass clung to his boots. The ground had been soaked and then hardened again, a pattern that no crop could survive. In the distance, one of the fence posts had fallen, and the old chicken coop leaned to one side, as if the whole farm were slowly exhaling its last breath. He walked to the edge of the property where the field began. The silence there was almost painful. Even the insects seemed to avoid this place now. He bent down and picked up a handful of dirt, letting it slip through his fingers. It left a dark stain on his skin, wet but lifeless. The earth had nothing left to give. He had tried everything, rotating crops, saving water, borrowing to buy better seed. Each year the returns grew smaller. Each year the letters from the bank grew sharper in tone. The last one he'd received was still lying unopened on the kitchen table. He didn't need to read it to know what it said. He could already see the end written across the horizon in fading lines. The storm from the night before had been fierce, louder, and more violent than any he'd seen in years. The wind had howled through the house, shaking the windows and tearing branches from the pecan trees. When the rain finally came, it was not gentle. It pounded the earth, forming small rivers that carved through the dry field and pooled near the lower fence. He'd sat by the window, watching the lightning flash across the valley, listening to the roof creak and the wind push against the walls. Part of him hoped the storm would wash everything away, his debts, his failures, the years of trying. But when the thunder rolled off into the distance and the sky quieted, the house was still standing, and so was he. Now, walking across the field, Malcolm felt the strange softness of the soil under his boots. The rain had churned it up, revealing stones and roots that had been buried for years. Something glinted near a puddle ahead, a reflection that caught his eye. He squinted, thinking it might be a piece of metal or a shard of glass, but as he drew closer he saw it wasn't sharp at all. It was round, perfectly round, and black, darker than anything around it, slick with moisture. He knelt down. It was about the size of a goose egg, but heavier when he lifted it. It was warm against his palm, as though it had been lying in the sun all day. He turned it over and rubbed a thumb along its surface. Smooth, almost polished. He straightened slowly, his knees creaking, and looked around. More of them, half buried in the wet earth, nestled in the mud like stones that didn't belong here. He counted at least a dozen, maybe more. They were scattered unevenly across the shallow dip of the field. The black shells stood out sharply against the pale dirt like drops of oil floating on water. For a long moment, he didn't move. He just stared, unsure whether to be afraid or grateful. Malcolm's first thought was that they might be snake eggs. He'd seen enough of those in his life, but these were too large and too dark. Snake eggs were leathery and pale, not shiny like obsidian. He scanned the area for movement, listening for the dry whisper of scales in the grass. Nothing. The only sound was the wind brushing the tops of the weeds. If these belonged to some animal, it was gone now. He crouched again and gathered a few into his old hat, careful not to crack them. Each one felt the same. Smooth, solid, strangely warm. He felt an unease deep in his chest, the same kind of unease that comes when a man knows he's about to make a mistake but does it anyway. Still, he couldn't leave them lying there. They were on his land, and if the land had finally given him something, anything, he wasn't going to ignore it. Back at the house, he set the hat on the table beside the cold stove. The eggs glistened in the lamplight, their black shells reflecting bits of yellow flame. He stood over them for a long time, arms folded, eyes narrowed. There was beauty in them, a kind of mystery that stirred something in him. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was close. Maybe, he thought, they were from some exotic bird blown off course by the storm. Maybe someone would pay for something so rare. Or maybe, more realistically, they were worthless curiosities, odd-looking stones mistaken for eggs. He reached out and touched one again. Still warm. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Warm meant alive, and alive meant change. He didn't like change anymore. Change had taken his farm, his family, his faith. He pulled his hand back and exhaled. The night came down heavy. He didn't light the lantern again. Sitting by the window, he listened to the faint creaks of the house settling. Outside, the field stretched into darkness, hiding its secrets. From time to time, he thought he heard small noises, a shifting in the coop, a faint scrape, but he told himself it was just the wind. He closed his eyes, but the image of those black eggs stayed behind his eyelids, sharp and gleaming. When dawn came again, he was still awake. He went out and checked the field. The rest of the eggs were still there, half buried in the mud, untouched by animals. That was strange. In a place like this, raccoons, foxes, and snakes would have dug up anything edible by now, but these eggs seemed untouchable. The rain had washed the soil clean around them, making them shine even more against the dull earth. He collected the rest, filling an old wooden crate. By the time he was done, he had nearly 40 of them stacked neatly in straw. He carried the crate to the barn, where the air smelled of damp hay and rust. He covered the eggs with a blanket and set them on a shelf beside the broken tools. For reasons he couldn't explain, he whispered a short apology to whatever creature had left them behind. That night, he sat again by the table and opened one of the bank letters. The words swam before his tired eyes. Final notice, repossession, foreclosure. He folded it carefully and placed it under the crate ledger where he wouldn't have to see it again. Then he turned off the lantern and went to the barn. The air inside was cool and thick with the smell of wet wood. He lifted the corner of the blanket. The eggs glimmered faintly in the dim light. He leaned against the wall and listened. The world was silent except for the faint dripping of water from the rafters. He didn't know why he felt compelled to check on them so often, but something about them felt significant. As if these strange, dark shapes were the last chance this place had to give him. When he finally went back to the house, the moon was rising over the trees. Its light spilled across the field, catching on the faint curve of the freshly disturbed earth. From the porch, the field looked almost alive again, wet, breathing, waiting. He stood there until the chill set into his bones, then went inside and closed the door. That night, before he fell into a restless half-sleep, Malcolm thought of his father. The old man had once said, "The land will talk to you if you stay quiet long enough." He wondered if this was what he meant, because tonight, after so many silent years, the land had spoken, and it had whispered through the dark shells of those impossible eggs. And though he didn't yet know it, those black eggs would be the first breath of something new, something that would test him, save him, and change his life forever. For the first time in months, Malcolm woke with something that felt almost like anticipation. It was faint and unfamiliar, a quiet stirring beneath the heavy layer of weariness that usually blanketed his mornings. Outside, the air was cool and gray, and the smell of wet soil drifted through the open window. He lay there for a moment, listening to the slow ticking of the clock, before sitting up and rubbing his face with both hands. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of the black eggs appeared, shining in the mud, glinting in the lamplight, impossibly smooth. He dreamed about them, too. In his dream, they were everywhere, rolling out of the ground like stones pushed upward by unseen hands, covering the field until there was nothing left but black. He woke with his heart pounding and the taste of iron on his tongue. He tried to tell himself that it was nonsense, just exhaustion playing tricks on him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that those eggs didn't belong here, that they carried something he couldn't name. He got dressed slowly, buttoning his faded work shirt and lacing his boots, then stepped outside. The air was still damp from the rain, the sky the color of pewter. The barn loomed ahead, its roof sagging in the middle like an old man's back. He crossed the yard, each step crunching softly on gravel and wet straw. Inside, the air was cool and faintly sweet with the smell of old hay. The eggs were where he had left them, neatly stacked in the crate and covered with a frayed blanket. He lifted the corner just enough to peek inside. They looked exactly the same, black and glossy, reflecting the narrow beam of light coming through a crack in the roof. He touched one gently. It was still warm. His stomach tightened. He had left them out here all night, and yet they hadn't cooled. That wasn't natural. He took his hand away, uneasy. He stayed there longer than he meant to, just watching. It was quiet except for the occasional creak of the barn timbers in the wind. The silence pressed against his ears. Somewhere behind him, a loose hinge squealed, and he almost turned, but forced himself to stay still. He told himself it was nothing, just the house settling, the barn breathing as it always had. By mid-morning, the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. The wet fields shimmered faintly. He fetched a bucket of water from the pump and went back inside to clean the eggs. One by one, he wiped the mud from their shells with an old rag, revealing the strange sheen beneath. Each one was the same. No markings, no variation, no sign of a nest or any organic pattern. They looked manufactured, almost artificial, but when he tapped one lightly with his fingernail, It gave a soft, dull sound. Alive. He lined them carefully on the workbench and took a few steps back. They sat in 2 neat rows, gleaming like a collection of polished stones. The sight was mesmerizing and unsettling in equal measure. He couldn't explain it, but he felt that he shouldn't be seeing them, that they weren't meant for him. Yet the thought of leaving them out there for someone else to find filled him with something close to jealousy. The eggs had appeared on his land. That made them his. The wind outside shifted, whistling through the cracks in the boards. It reminded him of the stories his father used to tell, how the land sometimes returned what had been lost, how things buried deep in the soil could rise again after years of silence. His father had been a practical man, but, like many of his generation, he carried a kind of reverence for the ground. Malcolm remembered him saying once, "The earth never gives you more than you deserve, but it'll test if you're ready to take it." The memory stirred a strange pride in him now. Maybe, just maybe, this was the earth's test. That afternoon, he drove his old truck into town to pick up feed. The drive was slow, the road was muddy from the storm, and every bump made the truck's suspension groan. The town itself was small, just a handful of stores, a diner, and a gas station. At the feed store, he saw a couple of familiar faces, men he'd known all his life but hadn't spoken to much lately. They were leaning on the counter, talking in low voices. As he approached, he caught a fragment of their conversation, something about strange eggs found down near the river. He froze. One of the men noticed him and gave a brief nod. "Mornin', Malcolm," he said. Malcolm nodded back, forced a small smile, and went about his business, but his hands were unsteady as he loaded the bags of grain into the truck. If other people had found eggs too, that meant whatever this was wasn't just happening on his farm. And if word was spreading, someone would come looking. On the drive home, he noticed tire tracks along the road leading toward his property. They were fresh, cut deep into the wet dirt. He slowed down, scanning the distance, but saw nothing, just the familiar outline of his barn against the horizon. Still, unease prickled at the back of his neck. He parked near the house, left the truck idling for a moment, then turned it off. The silence was heavy again, thick enough that he could hear the faint hum of insects in the weeds. That night, he ate little. He sat at the table with a bowl of cold beans and stared at the lantern flame, listening for sounds outside. Once or twice, he thought he heard something moving near the barn, a shuffle, a whisper, but when he stepped onto the porch, there was only the wind and the creak of the weather vane. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. The farm had always been a quiet place, but this was different. This quiet felt watchful. He locked the barn door before going to bed. It wasn't much of a lock, just a rusted pad he'd found in the shed, but it made him feel better. As he lay down, he thought about those eggs again. He imagined them sitting there in the dark, lined up in their crate, reflecting the faint moonlight through the cracks in the roof. They seemed almost patient, as if waiting for something. The following days settled into a strange rhythm. He worked the small garden patch, repaired the fence, and checked the eggs each morning. They remained unchanged. He began keeping a small notebook. Nothing formal, just a few lines each day recording the temperature, the condition of the shells, any smell or sign of decay. He found himself becoming meticulous, almost obsessive. Each evening, he would sit by the crate and stare at them, noting how the light shifted across their curved surfaces. It was during one of these late-night checks that he noticed something that made his skin crawl. When he brought the lantern close, one of the eggs seemed to shimmer, not in the sense of reflection, but as if a faint ripple had passed beneath the surface. He blinked, leaned closer, and saw nothing. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. He rubbed his temples and forced himself to breathe slowly. "It's just the heat," he muttered, though his voice barely made a sound. Still, he couldn't ignore what he had seen, or thought he had seen. The next morning, he moved the crate deeper into the barn, away from sunlight, and covered it with thicker cloth. He tried to forget the strange flicker of motion, but his mind kept returning to it. He started checking the eggs more frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. He didn't go into town again that week. He didn't want to hear more talk, didn't want anyone asking questions. He had begun to feel an odd possessiveness about the eggs. They were his, and he didn't trust anyone else to handle them properly. The thought of strangers poking around his property filled him with an unfamiliar kind of anger, sharp and cold. One evening, as the sun was sinking low, he noticed movement along the far edge of his land. A truck, black or dark blue, moving slowly along the fence line. He stepped out onto the porch and watched it. The vehicle paused near the old oak at the corner of the property, then rolled on. He couldn't make out the faces of the men inside, but he saw one of them turn his head toward the house before the truck disappeared behind the trees. Malcolm stood there until the last trace of dust settled, his hands clenched at his sides. He didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every brush of wind against the siding made him reach for the shotgun leaning by the door. He knew it was foolish. No one was coming tonight, but the sense of danger had rooted itself deep in him. He felt as though the eggs had drawn something toward him, something unseen but real. By the end of the week, he was exhausted. The lines under his eyes had deepened, and his reflection in the mirror looked older than he remembered. Yet he couldn't bring himself to throw the eggs away. The thought was unthinkable. They were his now, for better or worse. On the 7th night after the storm, he went to the barn late, after the moon had risen. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. He stood for a long time in front of the covered crate, then slowly lifted the blanket. The eggs gleamed faintly in the pale light, each one perfect and still. He felt an unexpected wave of calm wash over him. They hadn't changed. They hadn't hatched. Whatever had drawn him to them, whatever fear he'd built up in his mind, seemed to fade just a little. He leaned against the wooden beam and stayed there until his legs began to ache. The barn was utterly quiet. Somewhere far off, a nightbird called. He took one last look at the eggs and then covered them again, carefully tucking the edges of the blanket as if putting a child to bed. When he stepped outside, the horizon was beginning to lighten with the faintest gray of dawn. He looked out across the field, the same field that had failed him for so long, and, for the first time in years, he thought it didn't look entirely dead. Something was stirring beneath the soil. Maybe it was foolish hope, maybe just the remnants of an old farmer's stubbornness, but he felt it all the same. He drew a deep breath, tasting the cool air, and whispered into the silence, "All right, then." He didn't yet know what kind of gift the land had given him, or whether it was gift or burden. But as he walked back to the house, his steps steady and his heart still restless, he knew one thing for certain: the earth had not finished speaking. And Malcolm King, against all reason, was ready to listen. The days that followed took on a peculiar rhythm, as though time itself had begun to move differently around the farm. Malcolm woke before dawn every morning and went straight to the barn, often without eating or even lighting the stove. The black eggs had become the first and last thing he thought about each day. They seemed to fill the silence of the house, the empty space left by the absence of his wife and son, the hollow ache that had settled over his life. Now there was something to tend to again, something fragile and mysterious that demanded his care. It gave him purpose, though he was too proud to admit it even to himself. Each morning, he would lift the blanket from the crate and examine the eggs one by one. He'd wipe away any dust or moisture that had gathered overnight, then note down their appearance in his notebook. The pages filled quickly with uneven handwriting, temperature readings, humidity levels, sketches of shell markings that never changed. He was meticulous, careful, methodical. It was almost a ritual now, one that steadied him when the rest of his world still felt uncertain. But with each passing day, the unease inside him grew. The eggs remained warm, unnaturally so, even though the barn was cool in the mornings. He could not explain it, and it bothered him. Warmth meant life, or at least the potential for it, and life meant responsibility. He didn't know what kind of creature could have laid these things, and the not knowing gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. Sometimes he would wake suddenly, sure he'd heard something moving in the barn, a faint scrape, a small thump, but when he went out to check, he always found everything still. The silence afterward always felt heavier. On the 10th day after the storm, he decided he couldn't simply watch and wait anymore. The eggs demanded more than that. He remembered his father's old incubator, a contraption of wood and wire that had once filled the barn with the faint hum of electricity. It had been years since he'd used it, years since he'd needed to, but he still remembered how it worked. That afternoon, he pulled the dusty box from behind a stack of broken plows and set it on the workbench. The heating coil was rusted through, but the frame was solid. He spent the rest of the day repairing it with what he had: an old light bulb socket, some scrap wire, a sheet of glass scavenged from a broken window. It was crude, but it would hold a steady temperature. By the time he finished, the sun had set. The light from the single lantern made the inside of the barn look almost alive, the shadows breathing along the rafters. He carried the eggs from the crate to the incubator with the careful hands of a man handling something sacred. He arranged them in 2 neat rows, each cushioned by straw, and lowered the glass lid into place. The bulb glowed softly, casting a faint golden hue over their black shells. For a long while, he simply watched them. They seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. He adjusted the temperature several times before he was satisfied. The air inside the incubator shimmered faintly with heat. He could almost imagine the warmth seeping into the shells, stirring whatever lay dormant within. When he finally stepped back, his eyes burned from strain. He left the barn with a strange mixture of satisfaction and dread. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of crickets outside. He told himself that he was being foolish, that these were only eggs, and that no matter what came of them, it wouldn't change the fact that he was a middle-aged man with too much debt and too little hope. Yet the thought of them hatching, of something living being born on his land again, filled him with a fragile sense of possibility. It was the same feeling he'd had when his son was born, a quiet disbelief that the world could still create something pure. At first light, he was back in the barn. The incubator was warm, humming faintly. He peered through the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The eggs looked unchanged, their glossy black shells glimmering faintly in the weak dawn light. He adjusted the humidity, wiped away condensation, and made another entry in his notebook. This became his routine. Days slipped into one another. He barely noticed the passing of time anymore. He stopped going into town altogether. The fields were left untended, the fences unrepaired. The world beyond his property might as well not have existed. His focus narrowed to the small rectangle of glass and the dark shapes beneath it. Each morning, he'd check the thermometer, adjust the lamp, and wait for something, anything, to happen. He told himself he wasn't obsessed, but he was. The eggs had become his entire world. It was on the evening of the 6th day that he thought he saw movement. The air inside the incubator wavered with heat, distorting the view slightly, but he could have sworn one of the eggs trembled. He leaned closer, pressing his forehead almost against the glass. There it was again, a faint shiver, like a pulse under the shell. His breath caught. He waited, hardly daring to move. A moment later, it stopped. He stayed like that for several minutes, staring until his eyes watered. When he finally stepped back, his knees felt weak. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. The isolation that had once felt suffocating now seemed like protection. Whatever was happening here belonged to him alone. He couldn't explain why, but the thought of someone else knowing, of someone taking interest, made him feel exposed, almost violated. The eggs were his secret, and secrets, he knew, could be both a burden and a blessing. That night, a wind rose over the valley, rattling the windows of the farmhouse. Malcolm lit the lantern and made his way to the barn, afraid the glass lid might have shifted. When he opened the door, a rush of warm air met him. The incubator glowed softly in the dark, the eggs glistening as though slick with oil. He stood there, listening. The barn creaked and moaned, and from somewhere high in the rafters came the faint flutter of wings, probably just a bat or bird caught out in the storm. But when he turned back toward the incubator, he heard something else, a sound so soft he almost missed it, a tiny clicking, like fingernails tapping on wood. He held his breath. The sound came again, then stopped. He waited for nearly an hour, eyes fixed on the eggs, but nothing more happened. When he finally returned to the house, dawn was already beginning to show. He collapsed onto his bed, his mind racing. He told himself he was imagining things, but deep down he knew he wasn't. Something inside those shells had stirred. In the days that followed, his life became a blur of motion. He ate only when he remembered, slept in short bursts, and spent nearly every waking moment in the barn. He adjusted the lamp, measured the temperature, scribbled notes he could barely read. The smell of oil and straw clung to him, and his hands were stained dark from dirt and soot. Yet, for all his exhaustion, there was a fierce energy in him, a sense of being alive again. He hadn't felt that in years. Once, while checking the eggs, he caught his reflection in the glass lid. The face that stared back at him was gaunt, eyes hollow, hair disheveled. He looked like a man possessed. It frightened him for a moment. He turned away, ashamed of the hunger he saw in his own eyes, the hunger for something beyond explanation, something he couldn't let go of even if he wanted to. On the 14th day, he noticed cracks forming in two of the shells. They were faint at first, barely visible lines that caught the light differently. He touched one with a trembling finger. It was warmer than the rest, almost hot. A thrill shot through him, followed by fear. He didn't know what would emerge, only that it was close. He spent that night in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, the lantern burning low beside him. The rain began again outside, steady and cold, drumming against the roof. Hours passed. The cracks deepened. Once or twice he thought he saw movement, but it was too faint to be sure. His mind wandered in circles, replaying every moment since he'd first found the eggs. How easily he could have ignored them, left them to sink back into the mud. But no, he'd brought them here, nurtured them, given them life. Whether that was wisdom or folly, he no longer knew. Sometime near dawn, his head dipped forward and he dozed off. He dreamed of the field, of the storm, of dark shapes rising from the earth like breathing stones. When he woke, the lantern had gone out, and pale sunlight was creeping through the cracks in the barn wall. He blinked, disoriented, and turned toward the incubator. For a moment, he thought his eyes were still adjusting to the light, but then he realized what he was seeing. One of the eggs had split open. A small black shape lay half-curled inside, slick and trembling. He stared, unable to move. Then it lifted its head weakly and let out a sound so soft it barely reached him, a tiny, fragile chirp. His heart seemed to stop. He leaned closer, watching as the creature struggled free of the shell. Its feathers, if they could be called that, were wet and shining like ink. It blinked once, twice, and then went still, breathing in shallow, rapid bursts. Malcolm sank to his knees beside the incubator. A strange feeling washed over him, awe, relief, terror, all tangled together. He didn't speak, didn't dare. The tiny creature was unlike anything he had ever seen, yet undeniably alive. And as he stared, another egg began to crack. Then another. The soft tapping filled the barn, steady and deliberate, like rain against glass. He stayed there for hours, watching the slow, miraculous struggle unfold. The smell of damp straw and warm earth filled the air. By midday, 5 of the eggs had hatched. 5 small black chicks moved weakly under the glow of the lamp, their down glistening as if polished. He felt an ache in his chest so strong it made his eyes sting. When the last one finally broke free, the light outside had faded again. He sat back, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. Around him, the barn seemed transformed. The world no longer felt empty. Life, fragile and real, had returned to his land. He didn't know what it meant or what would come next. All he knew was that something inside him had shifted, just as surely as the eggs had broken open. The silence of the past years had been cracked apart, and in its place came the faint, steady sound of breathing, of tiny hearts beating in time with his own. That night, as he closed the barn door and looked out across the darkened field, the wind carried the faintest scent of rain again. He tilted his head back, feeling the air cool against his skin. For the first time in a long while, he didn't dread the coming dawn. When the sun rose the next morning, the world seemed to carry a different light. It wasn't just the dawn breaking through the thin clouds, or the quiet sparkle of dew clinging to the grass. It was the way Malcolm saw everything. The tired fields, the broken fences, the peeling paint on the barn. All of it appeared softer, almost forgiven. He hadn't slept at all, yet he didn't feel weary. Instead, he moved with a kind of restless energy that came from disbelief as much as joy. The night before had changed something fundamental in him. The black eggs had hatched. Life had come out of that darkness, and he had seen it with his own eyes. The chicks were real, breathing, fragile and beautiful in a strange way that both fascinated and unsettled him. He opened the barn door carefully, letting in a beam of light that cut through the cool shadows. Inside, the smell of straw and warm air wrapped around him. The soft sound of peeping filled the silence, faint but constant. He smiled without realizing it. The chicks were huddled beneath the glow of the incubator lamp, tiny bundles of sleek black down that shimmered faintly like wet coal. They blinked their small dark eyes at him, curious and unafraid. For a long while he simply stood there, watching. It felt like witnessing a secret the earth had chosen to share with him alone. He crouched down beside the crate and whispered to them, not words of meaning, but sounds of comfort, instinctive and low. One of the chicks tilted its head as if listening. The gesture stirred something deep in his chest, a tenderness he had not felt since his son was small enough to hold in the palm of his hand. It was strange to think that these little creatures, so delicate and improbable, had come from the mud of his ruined field. The same earth that had refused to yield corn or beans had somehow given him this. He set to work immediately. The old brooder lamp wasn't enough anymore. The chicks would need warmth, shelter, food. He gathered scraps of lumber from behind the barn and spent the morning building a small pen, hammering nails with a steadiness that surprised him. Every strike of the hammer felt purposeful. When he was finished, he lined the pen with straw, filled a shallow dish with water, and crushed some feed into tiny crumbs. The chicks took to it eagerly, their quick little beaks tapping at the grains. The sound made him laugh softly. It was the first time he'd laughed in months, and the sound felt foreign in his throat. By afternoon, he was exhausted but content. He sat on a stool near the pen and watched the chicks explore their enclosure. They were fearless, moving with surprising coordination for creatures barely a day old. Each one looked identical, jet black feathers that gleamed with a faint greenish sheen when the light caught them right. Dark beaks, even darker eyes. There was something mesmerizing about them. He could hardly believe they were real. He thought of calling someone, maybe the county agricultural office or a local poultry supplier, but a strange possessiveness rose in him at the thought. These chicks were his. The land had given them to him, and he wasn't ready to let anyone else see them yet. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, a truck pulled up on the dirt road beyond his fence. It slowed, but didn't stop. Malcolm watched from the porch as the vehicle, a black pickup, rolled past. 2 men sat inside, silhouettes behind the glare of the windshield. The driver glanced toward the house, then kept going. Malcolm's stomach tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd seen that truck. He remembered it from a few days earlier, creeping along the property line after dusk. He stayed on the porch until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. When he finally went back inside, the uneasy feeling followed him. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just someone from town taking a shortcut, but deep down he didn't believe it. He had the sense that someone knew, or at least suspected, what he'd found. He didn't know how, but it felt true. He thought of the tire tracks he'd seen near the field, the strangers asking questions in town, and a chill ran down his spine. The next morning, he was still thinking about it when a knock came at his door. He opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, her red truck parked by the fence. She was in her 30s, wearing jeans and a jacket with the county veterinary logo stitched on the front. Linda Perez, she introduced herself, holding up an ID badge. The feed store owner said you were asking about some unusual eggs. Malcolm froze for half a heartbeat, then stepped aside to let her in. He hadn't mentioned much in town, certainly not details, but word traveled fast in places like this. In the barn, Linda crouched beside the pen, studying the chicks. "Well, I'll be damned," she murmured, shaking her head. "They're healthy, strong too, but I've never seen anything like them." She took one gently in her hands, examining its feathers. "These aren't dyed, are they?" Malcolm bristled slightly at the question, but kept his voice calm. "No. Found the eggs myself. They were black, just like this." Linda frowned. Strange? There's a breed out of Indonesia, ayam samani, that looks similar, but I've never seen them around here, not in Alabama. You say the storm washed the eggs up? Malcolm nodded, unsure if he wanted to say more. She promised to take one unhatched egg back with her for testing. Could be something rare, she said, almost absently. I'll let you know what I find. As she left, he watched her truck disappear down the road, a trail of dust rising behind it. For the rest of the day, he couldn't focus on anything. A part of him wanted to know the truth, but another part dreaded what it might bring. If these chicks were truly rare, people would come, and once people came, they wouldn't leave. That night, the wind picked up. The sky was heavy with low clouds that glowed faintly with the reflection of distant lightning. Malcolm sat on the porch with his shotgun propped beside him. The house was dark except for the faint light spilling from the barn windows. Every so often, he thought he heard a noise beyond the fence, a twig snapping, gravel crunching, but when he strained his eyes there was only the shifting shadows. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Near midnight, he decided to check on the chicks one last time. The barn was warm, lit by the steady glow of the lamp. The chicks were asleep, nestled together in a corner. For a moment, he felt foolish for his fear. Everything was fine. He was about to leave when he heard the distant hum of an engine. His heart leapt. He crossed to the window and peered out. Headlights swept briefly across the yard, then disappeared. The truck again. It was parked at the far edge of the property now, near the old oak. He could just make out two figures standing beside it. He turned off the barn light and waited, watching through a crack in the boards. The figures stood still for several minutes, then began moving along the fence line, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dark. Malcolm gripped the shotgun tighter. They were searching for something. He could tell by the way they paused and swept their lights over the ground. His pulse hammered in his ears. When the beams turned toward the barn, he stepped back into the shadows. The lights lingered for a moment, then moved on. After a few tense minutes, the men returned to their truck and drove away, their headlights bouncing over the rutted road. Malcolm stayed frozen until the sound of the engine faded completely. Only then did he lower the shotgun. His hands were shaking. He didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, he had made a decision. From now on, no one would enter that barn but him. He nailed wooden boards across the lower half of the door and moved a few heavy crates in front of it for good measure. He didn't want to scare the chicks with his hammering, so he worked quietly, pausing between each strike to listen. When he was done, he stepped back and surveyed his work. It wasn't much, but it would slow someone down if they tried to force their way in. The following days passed in a blur of anxious vigilance. He tended the chicks carefully, adjusting their feed, cleaning their bedding, monitoring their growth. They thrived. By the end of the week, they had grown noticeably larger. Their feathers had dried into sleek, shimmering plumage that caught the light like polished stone. They were strong, alert, and startlingly intelligent. When he entered the barn, they would turn their heads in unison, as though recognizing him. It was uncanny. Yet, for all the wonder they inspired, the feeling of unease never left him. The men in the truck hadn't returned, but that didn't ease his mind. He had seen the way they moved, deliberate and searching. They would be back. And when they came, they wouldn't be content to just look. He began sleeping in the barn at night, wrapped in an old blanket, the shotgun always within reach. Each creak of the walls, each whisper of wind through the cracks made his muscles tense. But every morning, when he saw the chicks safe and alive, he told himself it was worth it. On the sixth night, a storm rolled in from the west. The thunder began as a low growl and then built into a steady roar. Rain hammered the roof, leaking through the weak spots in the shingles. The chicks peeped nervously at the noise, pressing close together for warmth. Malcolm crouched beside their pen, murmuring softly until they calmed. As he watched them, he felt the strangest mix of pride and fear. He was their protector now, their only defense against a world that would surely want to take them away. When the thunder finally faded and the rain eased to a soft patter, he stood and looked out the window. The fields glistened in the dim light of the storm's aftermath. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of his sight, were the men who had driven that black truck, the men who might already know what he had. He didn't know why, but he felt sure of it. He turned back to the chicks and watched as one of them stretched its tiny wings, feathers gleaming like silk. A warmth spread through his chest, part affection, part defiance. Whatever those men wanted, they wouldn't get it. Not from him. He'd lost too much already. His family, his crops, his pride. He would not lose this too. The land had finally given him something again, and he would fight to keep it. Outside, the rain stopped completely. The world fell silent except for the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing, his and the chicks. The storm had passed, but Malcolm knew the calm wouldn't last. Something else was coming, something larger and more dangerous than the wind. He could feel it in the stillness, in the dark weight of the clouds lingering above the horizon. He didn't know when or how, but trouble would find him soon enough. And when it did, he would be ready. The first light of morning slipped through the thin cracks in the barn's walls, slicing the darkness into narrow beams that fell across the straw. Malcolm was already awake, sitting in a chair near the chick's pen, his shotgun leaning against the wall beside him. He had barely slept. The storm from the night before had left the air damp and heavy, and his body ached from the hard floor and the hours of vigilance. Every sound during the night, the creak of the rafters, the drip of rainwater through the shingles, had stirred him from the edge of sleep, his mind convinced that danger was waiting just outside the door. But now, as dawn broke, the world was still. Only the faint chirping of the chicks broke the silence, their small voices rising like fragile notes of reassurance. He watched them for a long time, his thoughts a slow tide of exhaustion and awe. They had grown so quickly it was hard to believe they were only a few days old. Their wings were beginning to take shape, the down giving way to sleek black feathers that shone like obsidian in the light. They moved with alert, curious energy, scratching at the straw, testing their balance, exploring the edges of their pen. They were unlike any bird he had ever seen, not just in color but in temperament. They seemed aware, almost intelligent, as if they understood that he was not merely their caretaker but their guardian. The bond between them was strange and wordless, but it was real. He rose and opened the barn doors to let in the morning air. The storm had washed everything clean. The ground outside glistened with puddles that mirrored the pale sky. The smell of wet earth and pine filled his lungs. For a brief moment, the farm didn't feel like a burden. It felt alive again. He stood in the doorway, feeling that rare sensation of possibility that had eluded him for so long. Then he remembered the black truck, the men who had come searching, and the feeling faded like smoke. Still, life demanded motion. He spent the morning tending to the birds, repairing the broken latch on the chicken coop, and feeding the few remaining hens that had survived the hard months. It felt good to work again. His muscles complained, but he welcomed the pain. It meant he still had strength left in him. Around noon, he sat down to eat, but the pantry was nearly bare. Just a few jars of beans, some cornmeal, and a half-empty sack of flour. The last of his money was gone. He'd been living on the edge of ruin for so long that it barely frightened him anymore, but now that the chicks existed, he had something to lose. The thought came to him quietly, like a whisper from the dark corners of his mind. People would pay for something like this. The eggs were unlike anything he or anyone had ever seen. The chicks themselves were rare, beautiful, and healthy. He could sell one or two of the unhatched eggs at the market, tell people they were from an exotic breed, something imported, mysterious. It wouldn't be a lie, not exactly, and the money would help him buy proper feed, maybe even repair the roof before the next storm. By the time the sun reached its peak, he had made up his mind. He chose 3 of the remaining eggs, polished their shells with a rag until they gleamed, and placed them gently in a small wooden box lined with straw. He hesitated before closing the lid, glancing at the other eggs still in the crate as though they might judge him for what he was about to do. "Just these," he murmured. "That's all." He loaded the box into his truck and drove toward town. The road was still soft from the rain, and the tires kicked up thin sprays of mud. As he approached the outskirts, he noticed people standing in clusters, their voices carrying on the breeze. News traveled fast in small towns, and gossip faster still. When he parked near the market square, a few heads turned, curious. Malcolm King hadn't been seen here in weeks, maybe months. The market was alive with sound, the calls of vendors, the clatter of crates, the low hum of conversation. He walked to the small table he sometimes rented when he still had eggs to sell, brushing away the dust. He set the box down and opened it. The black shells caught the light immediately, drawing eyes from every direction. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. People whispered to one another, leaning in close. "What kind of bird lays something like that?" one woman asked, reaching out to touch an egg before pulling her hand back as if afraid. "Imported," Malcolm said simply. "A rare breed." The lie felt strange on his tongue, but it came easily enough. The onlookers exchanged glances. Curiosity turned to fascination, and fascination to desire. Within an hour, he'd sold all 3 eggs for more money than he'd made in the last 6 months combined. The buyers were eager, some skeptical, but most were simply enchanted by the novelty. He took their cash with a polite nod, his face expressionless, though his heart pounded with a mixture of triumph and guilt. By the time he drove back to the farm, the light was fading. He stopped the truck at the gate and sat for a long while, staring out at the land that had once broken him and now seemed to be saving him. He told himself that what he'd done wasn't wrong. He hadn't stolen, hadn't cheated anyone. He'd simply used what was his. Still, as he walked to the barn and heard the soft chirping of the chicks inside, the unease returned. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the people at the market, their hunger, their wonder, their greed. He told himself that no one would come looking for him, that he was just another poor farmer trying to get by. But when he dreamed, it was of headlights sweeping across the field, of footsteps in the mud, of strangers' hands reaching into the pen to snatch the chicks away. The next morning, he woke to silence. The world outside was heavy with fog, the kind that muffled sound and made everything feel closer than it was. He went to the barn, as he always did, but stopped short at the door. Something was wrong. The lock hung broken, twisted out of shape. His pulse spiked. He pushed the door open. Inside, the straw was scattered and two of the younger chicks were missing. He dropped to his knees, scanning the floor for tracks. They were there, boot prints in the mud, leading to the side window where the glass had been pried loose. He ran outside, following the trail through the grass. It led toward the fence and vanished near the road. In the distance, he thought he heard the faint growl of an engine. He stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, his mind racing. They'd come in the night, just as he'd feared. Whoever they were, they knew about the chicks. Maybe they'd been at the market. Maybe they were the men from the truck. The thought filled him with a deep, burning anger that surprised him with its intensity. He turned back to the barn, his hands shaking. The remaining chicks huddled in a corner, peeping softly. He crouched down beside them, whispering words that were half comfort, half vow. "You're safe now," he said. "I'll take care of it." That evening, he loaded the shotgun and set it beside the door. He moved a chair to the window where he could see the road and waited. The hours passed slowly. The fog thinned and the moon rose, pale and sharp. Every shadow outside seemed alive. Once, he thought he saw movement near the fence, but when he stepped outside, there was nothing. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, a line he couldn't uncross. Days went by. The fear settled into him, deep and constant. He worked the farm as best he could, but his mind was always elsewhere, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The money he'd earned sat untouched in a drawer, no comfort at all. The chicks grew stronger, their feathers deepening into a sheen so dark they seemed to drink in light. They were thriving, but he was unraveling. One night, he woke to a noise outside, the crunch of tires on gravel. He was out of bed in an instant, shotgun in hand. The sound came from the direction of the barn. He stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at his skin. A vehicle's silhouette stood just beyond the fence, its lights off. Two figures moved near the barn doors, their shapes shifting in the dim moonlight. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice raw. The figures froze. One turned toward him, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. A flash of light, a reflection, something sharp and cold. Then they ran. He fired once, the blast echoing across the fields. The sound rolled away into silence. By the time he reached the barn, the truck was gone, its taillights vanishing down the road. He stood there for a long time, the gun heavy in his hands, the acrid smell of smoke in his nostrils. He didn't know if he'd hit anything, didn't care. What mattered was that they'd come back, and they would again. The realization filled him with dread, but also with resolve. If this was what the land had chosen to give him, he would protect it with everything he had. When dawn came, he sat on the porch with his face in his hands, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. The price of his secret was rising, and he had only begun to pay it. But when he looked up and saw the first rays of sunlight touch the fields, he thought of the chicks, their impossible beauty, their fierce will to live, and something hardened inside him. Whatever happened next, he would endure it. He had no choice. The earth had given him a second chance, and he would not let it be taken away. The next few days passed in a blur of silence and suspicion. The men hadn't returned since that night, but their absence didn't bring Malcolm any peace. Instead, it pressed on him like a weight he couldn't shake. Every creak of the porch boards, every gust of wind brushing against the side of the house made him turn his head sharply. He no longer moved about the farm like a man tending his land. He moved like a sentry patrolling a border. The shotgun never left his side. At night, he slept in the chair by the window, the faint glow of the barn lamp visible in the distance like a small, flickering heartbeat in the dark. The chicks were growing quickly, far faster than any breed he had ever known. Their feathers had thickened into a lustrous metallic sheen that caught even the faintest light and split it into a strange mixture of blue and green beneath the black. Their eyes, once bright and beady, now gleamed with quiet alertness. They no longer tripped over their own feet. They moved with surprising coordination, darting from shadow to shadow in the straw. Malcolm couldn't stop staring at them. They were beautiful in an almost unnatural way, so striking that looking at them too long stirred a feeling he couldn't name, something between pride and fear. Each morning, he'd check the field where the eggs had first been found, half expecting to find more of them buried under the soil, but the ground remained empty. The storm had passed, and the earth had gone quiet again, leaving behind only the mystery it had offered him. He sometimes wondered if the rain that night had been meant for him alone, as if the storm had washed something loose from the depths of the earth just to see what kind of man he'd become when faced with it. That thought both comforted and terrified him. It was late in the week when Linda Perez returned. Malcolm saw the dust trail of her red truck long before it reached the gate. For a moment, he considered pretending he wasn't home. The last thing he wanted was to share what little he had left with the outside world, but something told him that ignoring her would only make things worse. He stood on the porch as the truck came to a stop, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun. Linda climbed out, holding a folder tucked under her arm. Her expression was serious, not the casual curiosity she'd had before. "You got a minute?" she asked. He nodded stiffly and gestured toward the porch. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with the hum of cicadas and the creak of old wood. "I took that egg you gave me to Auburn University," she said, flipping open the folder. "They've got one of the best agricultural labs in the state. The results came back yesterday." She pulled out a few printed pages and spread them across her lap. "It's definitely real, Malcolm. Not dyed, not artificial. Genetic tests confirmed it's from a living bird." He nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "So, what is it?" Linda took a breath. "Ayam samani, Indonesian. Rare as hell, especially around here. Everything about it's black. Feathers, skin, bones, even the organs. It's a natural genetic mutation. People call it the Lamborghini of chickens because of how valuable it is. Breeders overseas sell them for thousands apiece." Malcolm stared at her. The words landed like stones in his chest. He'd suspected they were rare, but not this rare, not this valuable. The thought made his stomach twist. "I don't know how those eggs got here," Linda continued, "but I heard something a few weeks ago. Customs seized a shipment of exotic animals that came through the mobile port, smuggled in from Southeast Asia. Word is, a few crates went missing before the seizure. Somebody dumped them somewhere to avoid getting caught. Maybe your storm washed them onto your land." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "If that's true, then those men you saw snooping around, they might be the ones who lost them." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The barn door stood visible in the distance, the faint clucking of his other hens drifting through the air. He could feel the world shifting beneath his feet again, just as it had the day he'd found the eggs. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Linda hesitated. Technically, the birds belonged to whoever imported them, even if it was done illegally. But if there's no record of who that was, Well, it's a gray area. Still, I'd be careful. People willing to smuggle animals like that won't stop just because they lost a few. They'll come back." He didn't need her to tell him that. He already knew. She closed the folder and stood. "Listen," she said softly, "you've got something special here, but you've also got something dangerous. Keep your doors locked, stay alert, and if anything happens, call me." She handed him her card. "I mean it." He took it and nodded. "Thank you." When her truck disappeared down the road, the silence returned, heavier than before. He turned the card over in his hand, reading the neat print of her name and number. It felt like a connection to the outside world, something he hadn't had in a long time, but also like a promise he wasn't sure he wanted to keep. He slipped it into his pocket and went to the barn. Inside, the chicks greeted him with their familiar sounds, though they no longer looked like chicks at all. They had nearly doubled in size, their feathers dense and glossy. One of them, the largest, stood apart from the others, its head held higher, its gaze sharper. When he reached down to refill their water dish, it didn't move away. Instead, it stepped forward, pecked gently at his boot, and tilted its head as if testing him. The gesture made him smile, but there was something uncanny about the bird's confidence. It carried itself differently, almost regally. He worked quietly for the rest of the day, the words of Linda's warning echoing in his mind. That night, as the wind rustled the trees outside, he dreamed of the men in the truck. In his dream, they were standing in his field again, their flashlights cutting through the fog, their boots sinking into the mud. They moved closer and closer until one of them reached for the barn door. He woke with a start, heart pounding, the taste of fear bitter in his mouth. The following evening, the nightmare bled into reality. The sun had just set when he noticed a faint glow moving along the distant ridge, headlights creeping slowly toward the farm. He killed the lantern and stood at the window, holding his breath. The truck came closer, stopping just beyond the fence. For several minutes it sat there, engine idling softly. Then the lights went out. Malcolm's hands trembled as he reached for the shotgun. He could hear the faint crunch of footsteps now moving through the grass. Two shapes emerged from the darkness, barely visible against the night. They moved carefully, deliberately toward the barn. He waited until they reached the door before stepping out onto the porch. "Don't move!" His voice rang out, sharp and commanding. The figures froze. The taller one lifted a hand. "We don't want trouble," the man called back. His voice was calm, practiced. "We're just here for what's ours." Malcolm's grip tightened on the gun. "Ain't nothing here that belongs to you." There was a long silence. Then the other man spoke, his tone colder. "You've got something valuable in that barn. We know what it is. Hand them over, and nobody gets hurt." Malcolm raised the shotgun and fired into the air. The blast echoed across the valley, startling the birds in the trees. The men ducked, then bolted for the fence. The truck roared to life, tires spinning in the dirt as it sped off into the darkness. He stood there for a long time after they'd gone, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the air, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. When he finally went back inside, the chicks were restless, fluttering and peeping in alarm. He sat beside their pen until they calmed, whispering soft, steady words until the barn fell quiet again. That night, he didn't go back to the house. He stayed in the barn with them, the shotgun across his knees. The thought of leaving them alone now felt impossible. He'd fought for this land all his life, fought the weather, the banks, the slow decay of everything he loved. But this was different. This was something worth bleeding for. When dawn came, he made his decision. He couldn't stay here. The men would come back, and next time they wouldn't be frightened off so easily. He spent the day gathering supplies, feed, a few tools, a small crate to carry the birds. By sunset, everything was ready. He loaded the truck carefully, the largest of the birds watching him with bright, unblinking eyes. He paused once, looking back at the house. The windows glowed faintly in the fading light, each one filled with ghosts of memory. His father sitting at the table, his wife humming in the kitchen, his son chasing chickens across the yard. The farm had taken everything from him and then, in some strange twist of mercy, had given him one last thing to live for. He felt a pang of sadness so deep it almost doubled him over. By the time the moon rose, the truck was rolling down the dirt road, its headlights carving through the mist. He didn't look back again. The land had given him its secret, and now it was demanding that he carry it somewhere safe. He drove through the night, his eyes fixed on the narrow strip of road ahead. Somewhere behind him, the men would find the empty barn, the broken lock, the vanished birds. They'd search, but they wouldn't find him. Not this time. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt something close to freedom. The fear was still there, yes, but beneath it was resolve. Quiet, unyielding, and strong as the earth he'd left behind. When the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, he saw the outline of his brother's old farm up ahead, the silhouette of the house framed against the pink sky. He slowed the truck and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of everything he'd endured. The world was still, the road empty. He looked at the birds in the crate beside him, their dark feathers catching the pale morning light. "We made it," he whispered. The largest one lifted its head and let out a low, soft sound, not a chirp, but something deeper, almost like a sigh. Malcolm smiled faintly. For the first time in a long time, he believed it. Behind him, the old farm and all its ghosts were fading into memory. Ahead lay something new, uncertain, yes, but alive. He drove on, the rising sun glinting off the black sheen of the birds' feathers, the road stretching forward like a promise he was finally ready to claim. The road that led away from his old farm stretched long and quiet through the Alabama countryside, curling between low hills and wide fields still wet from recent rain. Malcolm drove through the gray of early morning with the windows rolled halfway down, the cool air brushing against his face. The black birds in the crate beside him rustled softly, shifting in the straw as though aware of their journey. They were calm now, far calmer than he had expected, and that steadiness, that quiet rhythm of life beside him, gave him the strength to keep going even as fatigue pulled at his bones. He had been driving since the night before, with only the occasional stop to stretch or pour gasoline from the jerry can he kept under the seat. His eyes stung from lack of sleep, but he didn't dare rest. The men who had come for the birds might still be searching, and he couldn't take the risk of being found. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the familiar outline of his brother's old property appeared in the distance. The land was smaller than his own and had been abandoned for years. A few trees leaned over the roof of the small farmhouse, their branches swaying in the soft morning wind. The place looked lonely, but safe, the kind of place no one bothered to visit anymore. Malcolm stopped the truck by the gate and turned off the engine. For a moment, the silence was so deep that he could hear his own heartbeat. He stepped out, his boots sinking into the damp grass. The air smelled of cedar and earth, and far away a crow called. He opened the back of the truck and looked down at the birds. Their feathers gleamed in the weak light, shimmering faintly with green and blue beneath the black. They blinked up at him, alert but unafraid. He lifted the crate carefully and carried it toward the house. The floorboards creaked as he crossed the porch, and when he opened the door, the smell of dust and old wood rushed out to meet him. Inside, the house was dark and cold. Spider webs hung in the corners, and the furniture was draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. He set the crate on the floor and stood for a long moment in the stillness, letting the weight of the past settle around him. It had been over a decade since he'd last been here. His brother had died young, and the land had gone to waste soon after. Now it would be home again. He would make it work, somehow. He had done harder things before. The thought steadied him. He unpacked the truck, carried in his few belongings, and set about cleaning. Dust rose in soft gray clouds as he tore down the old sheets and opened the windows. By afternoon, the place felt less like a tomb and more like a beginning. The birds, meanwhile, had grown restless. Malcolm took them outside, releasing them into the sunlight. They stretched their wings, moving cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Their feathers caught the light like oil on water, shifting through shades of violet and emerald. He watched, transfixed, as they began to scratch and peck at the soil near the porch, exactly like ordinary chickens, but with a strange grace that set them apart. For the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled without hesitation. The sight of them, alive, thriving, unbroken, filled him with quiet pride. That evening, he built them a proper coop behind the house. The boards were old but sturdy, salvaged from the collapsed barn nearby. He worked until his hands were raw and his back screamed with pain, but he didn't stop until the walls were solid and the latch secure. When the last nail was driven in, the sky had turned dark and the first stars flickered above the trees. The birds had already settled inside, huddled together on the straw. Malcolm leaned against the doorway and watched them, his breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. The soft, rhythmic sound of their breathing filled the silence, and for the first time in many years, he felt something close to peace. Weeks passed, and the new rhythm of his life began to take shape. Every morning before sunrise, he went to the coop, scattering feed and checking the nests. The birds had begun laying eggs, small at first but unmistakably black, their shells gleaming like polished stone. The sight of them made his chest tighten with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. He handled each one carefully, almost reverently, as though afraid they might vanish if he wasn't gentle enough. He stored them in wooden crates lined with straw, labeling the dates on scraps of paper. By the end of the second week, he had more than a dozen. He sold the first few quietly, driving into a nearby town where no one knew him. He found a small market stall and told the same story he had told before. Imported breed, rare but legal, raised on private land. The buyers didn't ask many questions. They were too busy admiring the strange, otherworldly beauty of the eggs. Word spread quickly, and soon collectors and restaurateurs from as far away as Atlanta and Nashville began calling. He kept his answers brief, his tone calm, his details vague. He didn't trust anyone yet, but he knew one thing for certain: the farm would never be poor again. Still, he didn't measure his success in money. What mattered most to him was the life that had returned to the land. The soil near the coop, once dry and stubborn, had begun to soften again, and wild grass grew where there had been nothing but clay. Birds nested in the trees by the fence, and the air smelled of growth. Sometimes, as he walked through the fields in the evening light, he felt as though the earth itself was healing. It was more than he had dared hope for. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope bore no return address, but inside was a clipping from a newspaper. The headline read, "Rare Indonesian chickens confiscated in multi-state smuggling raid." Below it was a photograph of several men in handcuffs, standing beside wooden crates marked with customs labels. The article said authorities had recovered nearly all of the missing animals, except for a single small shipment still unaccounted for. Malcolm folded the clipping carefully and placed it in the drawer beside his bed. The men were caught. The danger, at least for now, was over. That night, he sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The black birds roamed freely through the yard, their feathers glowing faintly in the fading light. The sound of their quiet clucking mixed with the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of the trees. He leaned back in his chair, a cup of coffee in his hands, and closed his eyes. He thought of his old farm, the fields swallowed by weeds, the ghosts that still lived in the walls of that empty house, and felt no regret. The land had taken everything from him, yes, but it had also given him something in return. It had tested him, and somehow he had passed. As the weeks turned into months, his reputation grew. People came from across the region to see the remarkable black chickens of Malcolm King. Some came out of curiosity, others out of greed, but he met them all with quiet courtesy and a firm boundary. No one touched the birds without his permission. He kept the operation small, careful. He refused to let what had once nearly destroyed him happen again. The money he earned went into the farm, new fencing, a proper roof, tools. Slowly, the property began to take shape, not as a monument to wealth, but as a place of purpose. One morning, as he was feeding the birds, he noticed the largest of them, the one that had always stood apart, behaving strangely. It circled the yard slowly, wings slightly spread, as if restless. Then it made a low, throaty sound that sent a chill through him. It was unlike any noise he'd heard from a chicken before, deeper, resonant, almost mournful. The others responded, gathering around it in a loose circle. Malcolm watched, frozen, as the bird tilted its head toward the sky. For a moment, the entire yard fell silent. Then, as quickly as it began, the moment passed. The flock scattered back to their usual routines, pecking at the ground as if nothing had happened. He told himself it was just instinct, some forgotten behavior from the wild ancestors of the breed, but the sound stayed with him long after it faded. There was something ancient in it, something that reminded him of the storms and the nights when he'd first found the eggs. It was as if the birds carried a memory of the world before man, a whisper of something timeless. He found the thought comforting rather than frightening. These creatures were a part of the earth, just as he was. The next day, a reporter from a small agricultural magazine came to visit. She was polite and curious, asking about the history of the birds, their temperament, their diet. He answered as best he could, keeping the story simple. A lucky discovery, hard work, and perseverance. When she left, she shook his hand and said, "You know, Mr. King, you've done something remarkable here. Most men would have given up after what you went through, but you turned it around." He didn't know what to say, so he just smiled. Later, when he read her article, the final line stayed with him. Sometimes the land gives back, not in the way you expect, but in the way you need. By winter, the farm was thriving. The coop was full, the fields green, and the air alive with the sound of clucking and the rustle of feathers. The birds had become his family, his purpose, his redemption. Each morning began with their cries. Each evening ended with their quiet rustle as they settled in for the night. The loneliness that had once haunted him had faded into something gentler, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since childhood. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sun sink low over the hills, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the black eggs. He turned it slowly in his hand, the smooth shell reflecting the last orange light of day. It was heavy and perfect, a small miracle born of hardship and chance. He thought of the man he had been when he found the first ones, the bitterness, the hopelessness, the way he'd nearly given up on everything. Then he thought of the man he was now, and for the first time in years, he felt whole. He set the egg gently on the railing beside him and leaned back, the wooden chair creaking softly. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of grass and wood smoke. Somewhere behind him, a rooster crowed. It was a sound that belonged entirely to the present, to life continuing. Malcolm smiled to himself. The land had spoken again, and this time its voice was kind. The storms, the loss, the fear, they had all been part of the test. He had endured, and in doing so, he had found his way back to the world. As darkness settled over the farm, he closed his eyes and listened to the quiet sounds of his reborn home, the whisper of wind through the trees, the soft clucking of the birds, the steady heartbeat of the earth beneath his feet. Somewhere, deep inside him, a peace long denied began to bloom. The man who had once stood on the edge of ruin had found not only survival, but meaning. The land had not betrayed him after all. It had simply waited, patient and silent, for him to listen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable real-life tales and emotional twists that you won't see coming. Hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next, because the next story might shock you even more. Watch our next video right now to uncover another life-changing story that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And if this one moved you, share it with your friends and see how they react.